Disclaimer. The information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GANs processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
And now let's all welcome Alex from Canada with a big round of applause from our souls. And what have you prepared for us today? Is it something we can eat or absorb? What do you have for us today, Alex? Thank you for joining us so much.
And thank you very much, Mark. I want to welcome all the people here at North American Teaching. And obviously, a quick look at the panel, you see that we're represented on almost every continent. And this is what makes this meeting so powerful. So what we are trying to do is to bring forward the teachings of Marian Tevkulikesh in these public teachings. And we'll talk about some cookies today, but I don't think you can eat them.
Well, can you pass the cosmic rays over?
You better fasten your seatbelt. We're going to have a really good ride. Just confirm to me audio and video is good, please.
Yep, we see your screen and your voice is perfectly clear. Thank you, Alex.
This is the Kesh Foundation Spaceship Institute Teachings on Plasma Science. We are in the intermediate level of the EARTHSPACE classes, and today's discussion is going to be on volcanoes. My name is Alexander. I am from Canada. It is October the 30th, 2022, and this is the Kesh Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. So welcome everyone, and as we went through the basic series, we're now going through the intermediate series, and they all pertain to the teaching, understanding, knowing, insight, and this is a continuation of the basic outer space series. And the thing is that we are having to, in order to understand in order to understand our space explorations, we have to understand our inner space and the space, of course, where we are, which is our Earth space. And so we delved a little bit deeper last week, and we went into the megasphere, and we found the soul of the Earth. So we have the soul of the Earth, and we have the soul of the Earth body, which only stands to reason, because we have a soul and the soul of the body. So by extension, that would be the conclusion. And so now we're looking at volcanoes in a whole different light. And the thing is that how does that relate to our search for outer space? Because you see, the thing is, we all want our piece of pie in that sky, and here we are stuck on Earth, and we have these volcanoes all over the place. But there is a relationship, and this is what I want to point out. So we're looking at book number 1, The Universal Order of Creation of Matters. is the bringing of these plasma fields together and creating a source. And then, of course, if the source is directing energy, then what is the origin of that source? And so we're looking at book number 3, The Origin of the Universe, and we find that our soul is very much part of the origin of the universe because it's intimately tied into the creation. So between our soul and the source, there has to be some kind of link, and this was book number 2, The Structure of the Light. And then when we look at the magnitude of the universe and we see our little tiny red dot in the bottom right-hand corner, that's our little tiny perfect world. And that is the pie that we're fighting for. And we only get a piece of that pie, not the whole pie. And so we see, really, you could say, the insignificance of life. But the thing is that it's not what we see, it's what we don't see, the phantom pie that we're all going for. And so when we talk about what a phantom is, it's something that's apparent to the senses, but has no substantial existence. Well, how is that possible? So the thing is that we do have satellites, and they fly around our Earth space. How do they do that? And then these satellites can become spaceships, and they go from one Earth space to another space, say a Mars space. And every night we are dream satellites, and we go wherever we want to go, and that's our individual trip. And then we find that there are other entities, and they have their own reality. But that reality is in a different dimension because we can't see that dimension. And so question, well, which dimension is the reality dimension? So we find that the reality dimension is that in outer space is not a place, but it's a method of energy transfer. And we know that energy is in motion. So to go from dimension to dimension, you have to go through this reality dimension of outer space to get there. So the method is the outer space, and the destination, well, that's your reality dimension. And we get to choose. So we have now chosen our little sentimental pie in the sky. And the way we choose is by understanding who our neighbors are, right? So we're not Venus and we're not Mars. So by default, when we are Earth, well, we could have by default been Jupiter, but we're not Jupiter either. So we create these boundaries to define who we are and who we are not. But we've taken this to an extreme because as travelers of the universe, we can go wherever we want to go. And did we know that we can do that? And did we know that we wanted to come here? And do we recognize that? And then when we come here, we find that regardless of whatever the season is, because we find that the Earth's position is changing, so it's not so handy that we're right next to Venus and so handy that we're right next to Mars so that we can get a relationship, but these planets revolve around the sun and the Earth revolves around the sun, and this is what causes the seasonal changes. And we see that in our weather patterns, and we're going to talk more about that. But regardless of whichever season it is, it doesn't affect our target shooting because we all got here. We don't know how we got here, but we got here. And so here is a beautiful place to be. I say it's heaven on earth. And so we don't have to look for it because we're here. But what we have to do is figure out why we're here. And the thing about it is that we have to clarify for poor Christopher Columbus and write him a memo. Dear Christopher, sorry to say, but the Earth was here before you arrived. So when we talk about discoveries, what we have to discover is our relationship with respect to the Earth space. And so when we're discussing things, we have to be specific and say, well, let's discuss man space. And so we find that plasmatically we have two souls. And we have a dichotomy with the GANs and the nanostate, which affects our emotion. And so there's a conversion between the plasma state and the physical state. And then the physical state, which is our physical body, and of course our environment. And so our environment, sentimentally, is Earth. And how handy is that? So we really have to define a couple of things. And when people give us only 35 seconds to do that, beg for an extra 10 seconds and explain to them that the plasma is a kind of energy state. And there are different kinds of energy states. And so our point of view is what affects our understanding. So the first thing we have to understand is our Earth space. And it is then from there that we can find our inner space. So when we understand these two reference points, that would be the key to the gateway to outer space. And this is vitally important because it affects your life. And if your life is not important, well, I guess then nothing's important, is it? Would that be safe to say? So we have to figure out how the plasma operates. And so there are just a few basic rules. And we repeat them because our understanding is changing all the time. And so the meaning of the words also changes. And when I say change, I mean they become more meaningful. And so we find if it's more meaningful, just like the energy states, they increase or decrease. And what's fascinating is this is done by an order of magnitude. So 2 times 10 is not 20, it's 100. And the higher energy states feed the lower energy states. So we have to identify which is the higher energy state. But from a higher energy state, we can further manifest into what we call a natural creation. So it actually creates a higher energy state. But we can actually manifest into physicality. And this, unfortunately, we call natural decay. It's another energy state, but it's too is part of creation. But there is a third state. It's foreign to us at this point in time, and we're just being introduced to it. But we're introduced every day to the sun, and the sun is in a catalytic state, which means it's non-consuming. And so what is it doing? Well, it's transferring energy. And since the sun is at a higher plasma state, the way it transfers energy is higher by many orders of magnitude. So now we get a perspective on how this energy is exchanged, but there are rules because the plasma can absorb fields, but it can choose which fields to absorb. And so it has to create a barrier of fields. So to understand this absorption and this barrier, it's beyond science as we define science, but it's also bound to the ethos of the universe. So we have to take that into account as well. So that goes beyond the rules of science. And so what we're talking about is a relationship, which we call a magnetic and a gravitational balance. And that is what we call a maggrav. And this is a reflection of the scientific responsibility of the awake state and the spiritual responsibility of the dream state. And so we find that the plasma science adds to this knowledge. The question, of course, is what is the rate of change and how can we change that? So we try and change our field relationships often in an adversarial basis. But if you look at the universe, it works in a coexistence. And this coexistence happens to include our Earth space. And within the Earth space, there is an inner space. But isn't it interesting that an Earth space has an inner space, and of course our man space has an inner space. So there is something to meet on a common platform. And the Keshe Foundation, of course, is the place where science meets the soul of man for peace, because that's the ultimate field relationship. And so when we came to Earth and we targeted Earth, we have many, many energy levels that we could transition through. And so if we say categorically that the magnetosphere is the outer part of the Earth space, in a way that's not true, because we find that the moon is traveling around the Earth, and so it is attached to the Earth space. So quite literally, the effect of the Earth space does go to the moon side, and the moon side does not have an atmosphere as it is between the magnetosphere and the Earth's crust. We have an atmosphere there. And within that atmosphere and the crust is our biosphere range. And we know that this is all our living range, because most of us either travel on the surface, or we travel in the air, and some of us travel underground. And then, but when we say underground, we say above the magmasphere, because the magmasphere is more related to the Earth brain than it is to the Earth space. And so the magmasphere, it becomes this unknown area. But all of these are part of the Earth space, and they are all different ranges. In other words, they have different energy fields. And we are capable of transitioning these energy fields on Earth. If we are capable of doing that on Earth, then most certainly we would be capable of doing that between planets. And why stop there? We can go beyond that as well. So in other words, to go beyond the solar system. So this is all based on density, as we see. And when we say it's based on density, it's based on the gravitational effect. So the gravitational effect is drawing the energy in, and the magnetical effect, of course, is allowing the energy to go out. And so when we look at the energy transfer, we find that the magnetical energy is the residue beyond the maggrav state. The maggrav state being the balance between the magnetical and gravitational field forces. So if we say it's magnetical, then it's beyond the maggrav state magnetically. And if we say gravitational, it's beyond the maggrav state gravitationally. So we need to understand that, because when we look at the fundamental principle of the twinity, here we have a dynamic action between the electron and the proton. So we can see that the proton is a much larger plasma field than the electron. So by default, the electron becomes negative and the proton becomes positive. But these two work together, and we call them the atom. What is startling is that the proton is 1,849 times larger than the electron. And so there's some kind of bond between these two that compensates for this mass differential. And science has been having a lot of difficulty explaining these things, but in the Keshe Foundation, we see that this is all part of the core component dimension. And when we look at the core component dimension, so we say, well, the atom is gravitational, because what we're looking at from the atom is the electron-proton combination. Well, guess what? The ray is also an electron-proton combination, except that it's magnetical. Well, how can it be magnetical, or how can it be gravitational? And so this depends on the relationship. And so if we could understand this relationship better, then we could understand motion, and transmutation. And isn't that what we're discussing now? Because we're in the intermediate stage now, moving to advance our knowledge. And so when we're looking at the nuclear decay of the neutron, so we see a station, we call this the initial fundamental plasma of the neutron. And from there, there's a decay process, which means it goes to a lower level. And in that lower level, we see the clear differentiation between the electron and the proton, but the combination of the atom remains. But there is a difference, and that difference is the release of the PM ticks. And we know that the PM ticks are the ray. So we're looking at the electron-proton combination, which we call the atom being the gravitational field, and the PM ticks being the combination of the matter, dark matter, and antimatter being the magnetical field. And so when you have a magnetical field, you have to have a gravitational field. But what we have to understand is that this is a two-way street. So when we're looking at these reference points, what we're looking is at the net, not the gross, the net energy transfer. And the net energy transfer, and we all know that the emission is out on the North Pole. And so when we say the North Pole, we can say that this is the release of PM ticks between two plasma fields. But if you're referencing one plasma field, then you can have a ray emission out of the y-axis. If it's coming out of the y-axis, the North Pole, and then the rays are absorbed through the South Pole. But that is just the net. And in order to have the net, we have to remember that there is a gross energy carrying. All the energy is carried, in other words. And it's when we have a balance, we have a magrav. When we have a residue, it can either be magnetical or gravitational. So therefore, for reference purposes, the emission is out of the North Pole. But the truth is, as a two-way street, the emission is also out of the South Pole. It's just that the North Pole emission is magnetical and the South Pole absorption is gravitational. And so the only way that we can determine that is by having a reference point. And so that reference point requires two fields. And that's how you know the difference between a launch field and a landing field. Because if you launch from one field and you land in another field, in order to come back, that so-called landing field has to transform into a launch field. And the launch field that you originally started from has to transform into a landing field. And so these are the skills that we have to learn. And there's a bond that is between here, and this is what I refer to as the reality dimension. The reality dimension that links up the plasmatic spectrum of the energy transfer with the physicality spectrum of the energy transfer. So we understand that the plasmatic spectrum is in a different dimension, and the physicality spectrum is in a different dimension, although it's in a lower energy state. In fact, the physicality spectrum is the lowest energy state. But that doesn't mean low in quality. That just means in a greater gravitational form, which we call an energy binding. But energy binding has a connotation of being a bad thing. And it is because of our actions. What we see in the universe is that the energy that is moving through these reality dimensions is actually a feeding pack. And that feeding pack comes in a variety of flavors. And so all of these flavors come together with respect to nearness and proximity, and they dilute together to create a composite plasma charge. And this is what contributes to the spice of life on this planet. And it's manifested through the gathering of the aminogen. And this aminogen is based on the gradient charge of the atmosphere. Well, the atmosphere is right around the planet. So is it the same everywhere? Well, obviously it's not, because there's over close to 8 billion souls on this planet, and each of us is unique. And then each of us have a dream energy, and that dream energy can travel somewhere else and engage others. So we didn't specify which others. So the obvious conclusion would be the others off of this planet. However, we now find that there are others in the universal community. So it is entirely possible for us through our dream energy to engage others beyond the 8 billion that we claim are on this planet. And so the fundamental rule, for simplicity's sake, is that the higher strength feeds the weaker strength. And so the obvious question then is, what feeds the higher strength? And so all of this is really the basic understanding of magnetical force fields, which we call attraction and repulsion, which means attraction is gravitational, repulsion is magnetical. But this is not done without a relationship. And that relationship then is that there's a magnetical feeding and a gravitational feedback. The gravitational has to feed back the results of the feeding. And when it can feed back, then the magnetical can decide to continue feeding in that direction or in another direction, because you cannot prescribe the direction of the feeding. You can only prescribe the gravitational feedback. The radio station is playing the music, but if you're not tuned into the channel, you won't hear it. And it would also help to turn the radio on in the first place. But this is the key. So the PM ticks are flowing throughout the universe, and this is all part of the magnetical feeding. And they come together in this maggrav condition, which is a combination of the principal matter, transition matter, and the convergence matter. And so in a plasmatic state, this becomes part of the plasmagen conversion. But it can progress to a physical state conversion. Either way, this is a maggrav condition. And so this is part of the gravitational net feedback. And that gravitational feedback has to have a reference point. And so that reference point is the environment. And how dependent are we on that environment? Well, we're finding some very startling things, because our gravitational point, which we call a maggrav, and our environment, which is a gravitational point, which we call a maggrav, creates another field, which is a field interaction, which we call inertia. Is that exclusive to the man space and the relationship to the earth space? Well, no. For the purposes of understanding the sequences, the first thing we have to know is that energy is always a charge in motion. And because energy is always positive, we have to have a reference to something. So therefore, in order to have a reference, you have to know that all things are working in combination. But when we say combination, the obvious answer is 2. But it could be 3, 4, 5, and many more. And so now we realize that we have choices, and these choices have to be made in a definitive fashion. In other words, there has to be a clear-cut choice. And the best way to do that is to understand your position as the last man standing, because this choice is yours. You can't run off to somebody and ask them what their choice is and have it be the only reference that you use for making your choice. Because your choice depends on the feeding. You have to be able to turn on this feeding and likewise turn it off. And there is no physical switch. And then, depending on your position, you can change the strength. So therefore, you can increase the strength of this feeding or decrease the strength of this feeding as it suits. And when we say as it suits, that determines the positioning. So as it suits your positioning, it means that you can enhance your position or diminish your position. But diminishing your position does not in any way diminish your position, as in stature. You are still the last man standing and you still have the choices. But what it does is it behooves you to make those choices because the responsibility falls squarely in your lap. And so when we look at the Earth-space relationship and how it deals with it, there is a distinct difference, but there's also similarity. And so when we define what a volcano is, it's a rupture in the crust of the planetary mass object, such as the Earth. So the Earth is a planetary mass object. So right away, that implies that there are other planetary mass objects that could have a rupture in their crust. So we are talking about a universal phenomenon, not necessarily specific to Earth. We are also talking about a phenomenon that is not specific to physicality. But for our purposes, let's look at the volcano on Earth, and we see that it allows, in that rupture, to have hot lava. And the thing about the lava is that it's hot. And when there's hotness or flame, and when something gets burned, you have an ash. So there's a volcanic specific ash. And of course, gases are also released. And so in summary, we have hot lava, volcanic ash, and gases can escape from what we discovered, the magma chamber. And the magma chamber is this plasmatic field within the core. And interestingly enough, one of the byproducts that we get is a volcanic product that is hot sulfur. And so this hot sulfur comes from this magma chamber. And obviously, a couple of questions arise. Why hot sulfur? And how is that possible if the magma is in a rotating field in the core of the Earth space? And so we find that when we see this hot lava or volcanic ash, some of it becomes sulfur, and there is a gas that's escaping. And sometimes these gases are actually the incomplete physical manifestation of the sulfur. And so they're quite toxic. And so you find those that do sulfur mining, they suffer from many physical maladies because it's a dangerous practice. And so the cookies we were going to make today, or the wafers, well, that's these sulfur bricks. And that's the harvesting of the sulfur in the mines. I don't suggest that you eat that. But we look at the details of the Earth space, we find where sulfur is, and it's in on the periodic table of elements. It seems to be in a very strange position because it has a proton mass of 16, which is double the proton mass of oxygen, which is 8. And isn't it interesting that the sulfur becomes manifested at the point where the magma meets the Earth's crust, and the Earth's crust is made up of silicon and oxygen. And the bond between the silicon and the oxygen, among all the elements in the periodic table, is the strongest, or one of the strongest bonds. It's a covalent bond. There are 2 bonds in the oxygen, and there are 2 bonds in the 4 bonds in the silicon. And so it makes for a very, very strong bond. And of course, the oxygen is highly gravitational, which means it's highly positive. But the silicon is very dense, and so that constitutes part of the crust. So just below the crust is the magma, and the combination of the field of the silicon and the combination of the field of the magma produces the sulfur. So now you see what this positioning is, and why is sulfur so important? And because it has an enormous amount of energy in its mass. So we see that there's a transfer of energy from the core space in the inner space of the Earth space, and it creates something, and we've recreated that in the cups of life. And there's some nebulous point at which this is created, and it's different all the time. And when we gathered up the GANs, we see that we could take this GANs, which is kind of white, and put it in a glass bottle, which is made out of silicon. And it's an amorphous silicon, and it's transparent. So we can see the glance inside the bottle. And then we also put water in there, and the water is also amorphous. And so that means like in a liquid state. So the glass bottle, which is SiO2, and the water is H2O. And then there's the GANs. And so the GANs is CO2 or ZNO. So all things in combination. So one feedback, which is the GANs production, is a feeding byproduct. Something is feeding to create the GANs. There are plasma fields that are working together. And so when you look at the byproduct, it's a combination of things. And then furthermore, we have a hole in the GANs. And we know it's there because it hasn't gone, it's just transparent. We can see right through it. And so we didn't take a swizzle stick to make that hole. It made it on its own. So the energy is still there. And this is where we have the binding of energy. So we can look inside that hole and we could say, well, that is the core of this reaction, and it's of a binding nature. And because it's in a binding nature, we automatically know it's a rotating field. So then the question becomes is there any exchange in energy between these various fields? Well, that's not obvious. What is obvious, that this is all part of our biosphere dimension. In other words, This is the life-giving dimension that we have on this Earth space. And we could create other ganses beyond the CO2 GANs. We have the calcium GANs and the copper GANs as well. We've already mentioned the zinc GANs, but most importantly is the amino acid GANs, because that is a major contribution to the vertical and horizontal people state. And of course, the universal solvent, the water GANs, which is not only beneficial to our life forms, but it's also beneficial to our Earth space form. And so we find that this Earth space has a uniqueness in the crust, because the crust is the boundary of the magnetosphere, but the water is in between the crust and the atmosphere. And so we're always looking at this relationship of two fields. So within the cup of inertia, for instance, we have a magnetical field and a gravitational field, just like in all the other cups. But the cup of inertia itself is a byproduct of the cups of man and the cups of earth. And so we see the cup of earth has a magnetical field and a gravitational field as well. So this is the environment field. And so when we put all these fields together, we find that our soul, our emotion, and our physicality constitutes one relationship. Our environment, being the earth, constitutes another relationship, and the inertia is a combination byproduct of the two feeding fields. So the inertia becomes a feedback byproduct of the feeding process. So there's our part of the deal. And when we add all of it together, then these all become part of the plasma feeding dimensions. Well, what is this food that we want to be fed with? And so it all boils down to the energy. And up until recently, we have been exclusively faced with a deficiency, shall we say, an almost a 20% deficiency, which we've continually looked for supplementation. And we've continually looked for that supplementation exclusively from our Earth space. We have now been exposed to the other dimensions, the other reality dimensions, which are also part of the plasma feeding dimensions. So in other words, dear Christopher Columbus, the Earth was here before you. And so this was created through the binding energy paths, where energy is absorbed and comes in, and more comes in. And so this is done through a gravitational attraction. And then once we have that, in order to maintain that energy, we have to be able to increase its strength. And so to attract more energy, we have to give more out. And so that is done through the emission of energy out. And because we are absorbing more energy, we are able to elevate the energy path of the energy that we emit through repulsion, which we call the magnetical repulsion energy out. But at what rate? And so that becomes the thing. What we're looking at in terms of our maggrav feeding dimension on this planet, that rate is not 100%. And as the sun is, which is a catalyst, we are in a deficient state. We are also in a state of transmutation, where we will be having that supplementation coming in from other fields. And these other fields are also part of the maggrav feeding dimensions. Just because we haven't recognized them doesn't mean they don't exist. We have to tune in. So the only tuning in, as we've done, is looking for that confirmation point, which we see as our physical space somewhere on this planet. And so the verification is part of our transmission of energy, and the validation is our transition of energy. But really, our point of existence is the transmutation, because the transmutation is what allows us to travel through outer space. We are simply residing in some space, and that space is the difference between, as we discussed, our launch point and our landing point. And when that is equal and balanced, we can't see that. The maggrav in a balanced position is invisible. But we could say that it's also transparent. What do we see? Well, we see the residue. We are the residue. And why can't we see beyond that residue? Is because we have limitations. Limitations in the understanding of physical reality and understanding the relation with the plasmatic reality. And this is impacted on our soul. Well, we have now been able to liberate that soul into traveling through these other dimensions. And so we are beyond the transmission, beyond the transition, and now we are getting into the transmutation. So this is not a diminishment. This is not a dissolution. This is not a dematerialization. This is a changing of the reality dimension field strength. So let's review. A maggrav is the balance of the magnetical gravitational relationship. Well, in one sense, a magnetical gravitational relationship is a transition of ranges. In another magnetical gravitational relationship, it is a transmission of energies. The transmission balance is a relationship. And if it is totally in balance, then it's non-visible. But it's never totally in balance. There is always a transmission. In order for that transmission to occur, there has to be an impetus. So we're saying the transition of ranges, because it transcends different field strengths, is the impetus for transmission, remembering the higher strength feeds the lower strength. So there's your impetus right there. And so now we understand that we can create dynamic plasma boundaries. And so what these are is a reflection of the Earth space point within our Earth space field, and is basically a plasmatic manifestation of our soul spectrum. And to see this plasmatic manifestation, we see a radiance of the feeding field that comes from the inner space spectrum. But if there's a feeding, there also has to be a feedback. And then the feeding has to kind of transform from a feeding radiance to a feedback radiance. In other words, it has to transform from a magnetical feeding radiance to a gravitational feedback radiance. And furthermore, it can become a physical manifestation. So our understanding of the physical manifestation has to understand how these energy states flow. So conventionally, we say that the vertical energy flow is the transition. In other words, the energy goes out to North Pole and comes in on the South Pole. Remembering, of course, that that is the net, not the gross energy. That is the net difference in the energy. So the vertical transition goes out through the North Pole. So therefore, the transmission is horizontal. So in other words, the transmission is the energy flowing around the planet. Let's do a 90-degree reference change. Okay, we're turning this reference 90 degrees to the right. So the transition remains in its position that it goes through the poles. But from this point of reference, it's horizontal. And because the transmission is perpendicular to the horizontal, now the transmission becomes vertical. So whether it's horizontal or whether it's vertical is irrelevant from a plasma perspective. It is only relevant from an Earth space perspective. Right? Because when we look at the creation of the universe exists from energy and all things are working in combination, trying to converging to come into the plasma gen, which we call the matter state, the Magravs condition of the matter states. But do we know enough to take enough into account? And what do we take into account? And then when do we stop taking things into account? Right? Because if we don't stop taking things into account, we're never going to amount to anything because we keep accounting. So we have to be able to make that decision, and that decision is individualistic. It's unique because it's yours. And so you have to make that decision as if you're the last man standing. But we have to now understand that there's an interaction and that it's a two-way street. So the energy is always in motion. So if you look at the individual and you see that the fields come out of the North Pole and come into the South Pole, and so that's you. But you are working in combination with other fields. And so that too, the energy that comes out of your North Pole goes to the other's South Pole. And so when the energy is emitted out of that North Pole, it comes back into your South Pole. So if we forget about our own energy exchange and understand that in order to have an interaction, you have to have a two-way street. And so that is the net energy flow, not the gross energy. The gross energy is the Magravs plus the residue. And so the residue becomes the charge. But we're not worried about that relationship because energy is not only a two-way street within us, but it's a two-way street in reference to another plasmatic relationship. So we're going to take the picture on the left, which is exclusively the relationship between two plasma fields. And so we understand from a previous exercise that when we look at the universe and we see that it has a boundary as far as we know, but in order to determine that boundary, there has to be a reference point beyond that boundary, doesn't it? And if there's a reference point beyond that boundary, then how can the universe have this boundary? But anyway, what we want to point out is that the field is not round. There's a flatness to it. And the greater the flatness, the greater the shine. And so when we look at the solar system, we find that all the planets rotate on the same plane. So we could say that the exchange of energy in the solar system is pretty flat. And so we look at the planet Earth, and we find it's not round, it's slightly flattened at the poles. This is an important point, because if we take this flatness and we do a perpendicular interaction, we find that the superimposition of the 90-degree rotation has a difference in its conformation. And so we have peaks and valleys. So this perpendicular interaction between these two fields has differences. It's not uniform. And as a result, we create a magnetical field and we create a gravitational field. And as a result, when we look at the magnetosphere of the Earth space, we find that if it were uniform, if it were circular, spherical, our planet would be all water. There would be no land. But thanks to the volcanoes, we created land. And so all of these lands are floating on top of this magnetosphere. And so if we're looking at it from the South Pole, we see the Americas on the left and Asia on the right, and Europe up top, and then Australia is always on the bottom. But, you know, everybody's got their feet planted on the ground. And so we see that between these peaks, which are the land masses, of course, the water is in between. And these are the various oceans. And then at the core, and that's within the magnetosphere, we have our maggrav position in the core of the highest gravitational field. And of course, it's in balance, which is why it's not visible. And we take that principle and then understand that other plasma fields have the same characteristics. And are we specific about which plasma field? No, we just broadcast. And so we broadcast through different dynamic plasma dimensions, and then there are dynamic plasma interactions, as we just described. And this is where the reality dimension comes in. The feeding radiance from one plasma to the feedback radiance of the other plasma. And of course, that feedback radiance to complete the energy transfer is feeding back to the feeding radiance. So this is where the dynamic plasma goes beyond the physical dimension, beyond the plasmatic dimension, beyond the current reference point. And we decide whether we absorb that energy or whether we put a barrier to that energy. We decide uniquely, individually, because we are the last man standing and we have the knowledge within us. Whether we admit it or whether we just do it intuitively, we have it. And that is the reason why that we now are able to actually facilitate transportation between these dimensions. And these dimensions may be on the same energy field, or maybe even transcend into different reality dimensions. We're just opening that door. So everything fundamentally is based on where two forces come together, you see. It is because when these two forces come together, then they create this Magritte condition. And so the universal energy, which is harvesting that energy all the time, the byproduct is self-enhancement. And so we as man, in our man-space viewpoint, have opted to do loosh harvesting, which is the self-consumption of energy. And so if it's self-consuming, and we don't see that it's self-consuming because we're consuming it from others. But in the process of consuming that energy from others, we have to understand that we're consuming from the lowest energy source when the highest energy source is giving it freely. And so we look at the magmasphere and how it was created, and we see that it was fluid, it was hot, very dense, very gravitational. It's below the biosphere range, and it's non-differentiated, right? So the vanishing point is in the core, and the soul of the earth is in that core. And so how do we differentiate from this core into landmass and water mass and sulfur and other things that are part of the periodic table of elements? And so this just contributes to understanding of the overlapping fields. So our magmasphere positioning is in line with all of these other things. So if we're sitting on the backside of the sun and looking towards Mars, we see before us that we see the Earth space. And that Earth space is now, we know, comprised of a biosphere and a magmasphere. And then, of course, the moon space is part of the Earth space as well. And then there's man space. And then there's vertical people space and other horizontal people space, right? And then we add the satellites that go around in that space and the spaceship space that goes in between these. And then, of course, the conclusion is, well, there's the Mars space. And to travel from any of these spaces to the Mars space, we have our travel space, which we call the Universal Enhancement Spaceships. So now we may better understand, or we're understanding better, that the soul of the man is the essential you. And so the essential you is interacting between the plasmagen state and the mattergen state. So therefore, you have to have an environment to relate to. And the soul of the body does that. The soul of the body does that on your behalf. That's the surrogate you. And so the soul of the body is interacting between the plasmagen state and the environment state. Well, which environment state did we specify? Which plasmagen state? Well, did we specify that either? So there are many possibilities. At some point in time, there's a target field. And that target field leads to this manifestation. So it's the plasma feeding that leads to this manifestation. And this manifestation may be non-tangible or tangible, non-visible or visible, plasmatic or physical. And then there's that specialty, the emotion of presence, because the emotion of presence is another interacting field. And the form artifact is at the manifestation point. And what is that manifestation point? It could be a physical reality, but it must be a plasmatic reality. So these are the two matter plasma dimensions. One is physical, one is plasmatic. In terms of the feeding, the dominant state is the plasmatic state. Which dominant matter state are you? So there's a commonality of these phantom fields. So from our men's space understanding, we have two souls, two emotions, two physicalities. And in order to maintain that, we have an inner space within the inner space. And that whole space is interacting with the earth space. So therefore the earth space also has to have the two physicalities. And the two physicalities have to manifest from two plasmatic realities as well, which are the biosphere and the magnosphere. And the reaction between those fields and the man-space fields is the inertia field. But that is not the only reaction. And this is why 1 + 1 is more than 2. Because we have two feeding dimensions. And we keep those feeding dimensions to continue feeding. And so the third dimension, which is the byproduct, is actually the feedback dimension, and we keep that dimension as well. And then we, as observers of these dimensions, well, you can't be part of that dimension and be an observer of the dimension. So we're not any of these three dimensions. We're in a different dimension. And this is important because this is one of the difference between how we navigate through man space and how we navigate through earth space. And so our relationship is with the soul of the earth, isn't it? And the soul of the earth now we find is in the core of the magnosphere. And so our soul of the man is within our body. And so the soul of the earth body has to be within the earth space, as the soul of our body has to be within our body. And so therefore the manifestation of the physicality of the earth space is the physicality of the earth body. The physicality of our body, the soul of the body, manifests into the physicality of our body. So there's a direct relationship to how energy is transferred from our soul and the soul of the earth. So the question then becomes, dear Christopher Columbus, what attracts to the soul of the earth? So we had the soul of the solar system plus the soul of the sun attracted the soul of the earth. This is the soul sequence of the convergence. And then the soul of the sun plus the soul of the earth now attracted the soul of the earth body. And now that we have the soul of the earth body, that, along with the soul of the sun, manifests into the physicality of the earth. And from there, we have a divergence in the biodiversity and the spiciness of this planet, which is what makes it heaven. And limitation is not understanding our nuclear science, because we have now transcended beyond nuclear science, and we have to do that because the plasma science can neutralize the nuclear science, but only in the name of peace, because this is the ethos of the universe. In order to maintain life, which is part of creation, we have to have morality, compassion, and courage. It's automatic. It's not something where you flip on the switch. Well, now I'm going to be moral. It's like being sincere. You can't fake it. And so the way the satellites move and the way things happen, which we can't see, this is all done at a nebulous speed. but the speed is faster than Earth light. And then we find that the Mars light is at the same speed as the Earth light because it's all part of the physical light. So whatever speed with respect to this transcendence, it's faster than Earth light and it's faster than Mars light. So the key point is that when we are talking about physically moving through outer space, we have to understand that this physical manifestation is materialization. And so we can do materialization now and dematerialization through this reality dimension, which we call outer space. The unique discovery is that in order to transport ourselves, we require an understanding of transmutation. And in order to transport ourselves, we have to understand the origin of the magmasphere. And so that becomes part of the materialization. And we've learned how to replicate that. And so we, as the deficient species, have now moved to the head of the class, and we have the man-made capability of creating heaven on earth. And so this exposes why in our pursuit of happiness, we've always had a launch field failure, because we have never launched a rocket into outer space. So we don't know the Earth space rules. How can we understand the inner space or outer space rules? And then we look at the rest of the universe, and we're so preoccupied with that tiny little red dot in the right-hand corner, which we call man's universe, and then that tiny, even tinier white dot, that becomes the pimple. And that pimple is the pie, and we only get a piece of that pie. The difference in relationship is astounding. And as we grasp that significance, we start to see that we have not necessarily been focusing on what was important in our life. And fortunately, things change because we see that one of those fields, the soul of the earth body, is part of the peace stone. And because of the rotating fields on this planet, it transmits this energy right around the world. And we see that this energy is at a higher energy state than the land mass and the water mass. And we find that it is highly magnetical, which means it is giving. It is giving and giving and giving and giving. And the earth is responding gravitationally. And so what does that mean with respect to our biosphere? It means that we have to harvest the energy from the plasma universe. And that energy is a plasma energy, because that energy is of an order of magnitude higher than the energy we have been useful, and we shouldn't be limited to one order of magnitude. We see that satellites are limited to a energy state, but we can go beyond the satellite level into the spaceship level, and that is even a higher energy state. And in order to successfully travel, we have to go even to a higher energy state, outer space. And we can't do that when we are binding energy. And binding energy is important, but not at the expense of others. And we do this through double crossing, lying, cheating, and stealing. And this affects those who actually practice that as well, because it becomes part of the self-consumption. And so when we look at the eruption of a volcano, we can say that it's a physical feedback pressure. So the release of the volcano, right, is a release of the pressure. We could also say that it's an earth-space pimple. We all know what a pimple is. And we see it as an expulsion of toxins. But how about if we see the magnosphere as a vacuum? And so then if there is this break in the crust, then the vacuum will want to immediately draw in the crust. And as it draws in that crust, it increases the pressure. And so the eruption becomes a vacuum process of healing, actually. And we know this is true because if it wasn't true, a volcano would keep erupting endlessly. But we know that a volcano will start an eruption and it will stop an eruption. And no man on earth has been able to flip the switch. The switch is in the wobble of the magnosphere. And the wobble comes as a result of the flatness of the earth. And this wobble affects the weather patterns around this world. And what's even more interesting is that 80% of the volcanoes are underwater. So we don't even see the eruption. And so this is where we come in with a Spanish description of an El Nino, which refers to the above average sea temperatures that periodically develop across the east central equatorial Pacific. And it represents the warm phase of what they call the ENSO cycle, ENSO. And La Nina refers to the periodic cooling of the sea surface temperatures across the east central equatorial Pacific. So if we're looking at the crust from the southern pole, and we see that the crust in the center of the Pacific Ocean is very, very thin. It is the thinnest point on Earth. And so we see Asia on the left and the Americas on the right. And above the crust is the Pacific Ocean, and below the crust, of course, is the magnosphere. And so this being very thin is like a cracker, and it cracks up a lot. And this is the ring of fire, what we call the ring of fire, which is a ring around the Pacific Ocean, where most of the volcanoes exist. And so these volcanoes we find are hot. And as such, because the Pacific Ocean is above that heat, then the water gets warm. And the water transfers the energy. And this is what the El Nino is. And it's cyclical. In other words, sometimes it's an El Nino and sometimes it's La Nina. If you're going to have warming, at some point it has to stop. And then you have cooling. At some point it has to stop. And then you have warming again. What causes this warming and cooling periodically? And that is the magnosphere wobble. And regardless of the season, or regardless of the wobble, the proof of concept of what we're talking about is that you were born. And you were not born on Mars, you were born on Earth. So you had a preference. And you were born in this solar system with the preference of coming to Earth because of sentimentality. and you were born using an outer space system, and you were born into the inner space, and from the inner space we came to the earth space, and in the earth space we came into our man space. And so the question also can be asked, is this only halfway through our round trip? Was this our landing point on our first stop, and from here we wish to go somewhere else? Or is this the beginning of a new trip? Is the Earth space a launch point, looking to go to some landing point and then coming back? So this is important to understand more fully our intention and our purpose, and to understand that, to cross this bridge of knowledge, we have to understand that regardless of the boundaries that we set up, we have to understand that we are inherently peaceful. That's the ticket. That's the transmutation ticket. The only way that science can meet the soul of man is through peace. And so that's what the KAKT Foundation is all about. And we know that's true too, because we have some excitable visitors that are coming through this path. Did we say it's a two-way street? So which reality dimension are they coming from? Stay tuned. This is the post-June 6, 2022 era, where we can make some choices. We can make some choices on the space beyond Earth space, how to understand our inner space and the position it has, and the transmutation through outer space. This is exciting times. This is the KAKT Foundation Spaceship Institute, teaching on plasma science, calling all Earth space patriots. There's a World Peace Treaty, and we need to sign it. That's our ticket to the universal community. Earth, as you know, has overlapping fields of life, and it has freedom from these boundaries, these man-made boundaries. These reality dimensions we're talking about are not affected by whether or not they're near space or far space. It doesn't matter. What our matter condition is earthbound. And within that earthbound state, we are looking for an atmospheric transformation, which allows for our physical and emotional enhancement at the vitality point. This is what the transmutation does, because it doesn't carry baggage from the transparency point to the manifestation. And illness and sickness are baggage. And so volcanoes are part of the healing process of the inner space of Earth space. And this healing process will help us connect to that nebulous point of the universal inner space of freedom. So in this process, the soul of the Earth exposes the man-made fallacies of man-made thought. Plasma science needs to be delivered in exchange for peace on Earth. So welcome to the outer space age. I hope you enjoyed this trip. Thank you all for listening.
Well, thank you for presenting, Alex. Although there's a lot there that you've covered, just like Mr. Kesh, it just seems we can't keep up. But there's something that's going to happen. I don't think we're going to have to learn everything specifically, as the soul already knows how to manifest itself, absorb energies, interact in certain environments. But it's these cosmic rays, apparently, that's one of the next steps that we're going to. You know, I was thinking while you were presenting this, Alex, that there's going to be so many stories to tell about people going into space and their experiences and things. I hope it won't be just property of the KAKT Foundation. So here's your next $1 billion idea. Instead of going to Facebook to share your stories, maybe we'll have something called Spacebook, where everyone who's traveled or gone to different places, can add their stories to a sort of Spacebook platform and let them tell their individual tales.
That's really cool, Mark.
So that's my $1 billion donation to whoever wants to pick up Spacebook, or maybe it'll be Kesh Spacebook.
And then we can sit around the campfire on planet Zeus and exchange stories.
Yeah, if you're traveling, and you know, this new system with the cosmic rays, it appears that one person in one seat can go one place and another person in the adjoining seat can go to a totally different universe. I mean, that it must be these fields that whatever you wish for, that's the interaction you get, and they're all there for everyone. I mean, an airline, you have to take off and land, everyone lands at the same place, but this is going to be totally different, it appears. And would you be by yourself? Would you travel in groups, or there would be no problem of being alone? Or maybe when you land, you become part of that family automatically and feel welcomed, and you've made new friends instantly.
Now,
Perhaps.
that's a really good question. And the really good answer to that question is,
Test it and find out for yourself? No.
well, you do this every night in your dream.
Don't we?
And isn't the significant point in your dream is who you interacted with? If you're telling a story of a dream,
Okay.
the significant point is your interaction with something else. If there is no interaction, then nothing happens.
Right.
Oh, what did you do last night? Oh, well, I went to the club. And what did you do? What did you do? Well, I met an old friend and I listened to some music. Okay, so those are the key points. You don't say, well, I when I walked through the front door, I walked on the floor. I mean, that's an insignificant point. You know, why bring it up? It is not significant to the discussion. It's not part of the event. What's part of the event is the interaction. That's what constitutes an event. You know, you go to the theater. What did you do at the theater? Oh, I sat in a chair. So what? You slept? You know, is that why you paid the ticket? No. What the story is, I went to the theater. Oh, it was a great show. The acting was terrific. The story was great. It made you cry. So all of this is interacting. But you know, you say, well, I'm interacting with the screen. Yeah, but the screen is a surrogate representation of the actors who created that image. And then within the auditorium, you're sitting there with all these other people who are going through the same experience and sharing it with you. And we all know that that energy goes beyond the physical limitations of the skin, doesn't it? And so you find that through the process, and especially if it's a really good story, through that process, everyone's come in with a different feeling, a different attitude. But at some point, around halfway through the movie, everybody is glued to the screen and everybody's following the narrative of the story and everybody's exhibiting the same emotion. And then when they come out of that theater, they all go their different ways and they all take what is relevant to them individually. And so if you were to take a survey of 10 people who come out of that auditorium and you ask them, what was that significant event of the movie? And they will actually tell you 10 different stories. And you say, wow, did they all go to the same show? So this is what we have to understand, that the event, this is the event, and we're part of that event. So we are participants as well as observers. And this is a unique capability, and we should cherish that. And so now, for the first time, we have the capability of understanding that in more detail so that this becomes useful information to us. And you know when you get close to the source. The closer you get, the greater the protest. That protest is we call censorship.
I'm not sure what you were trying to convey there. The closer you get to the source, the more censorship?
We have gone through all of our life without understanding the truth.
Oh, yeah.
We have these man-made fallacies of thought, and we've lived by them as if they're rules. And they don't, if they were a pail, they wouldn't hold water.
Sure, you mean like heaven and hell, for example, which we've
Correct.
probably all conjured up of what it would be like to be in either place, as we've seen
Yes.
many Dante's Inferno and other paintings to describe what it would be like, but now we know they don't even really exist.
Well, they don't exist is because they're a figment of our imagination.
Right.
So that is something that is totally changeable, isn't it?
Claudia
And
says,
once,
perfect, wonderful picture, Alex, and teaching. Thank you, Alex, from Steph. Elizabeth, thank you, Alex, to the very special teaching again. Claudia thanks you again. And Diane says, thank you, Alex. You add to me knowledge.
thank you all.
Mr. Cat, of course, the floor is open to everyone. Everyone has a mic, and feel free to open it and share something you'd like. This is the creation process when the fields interact. So we're creating something here in this meeting, even though we may not be aware of it. The souls are interacting, I would say, and they're doing some sort of work or mission or trying to change this or get something else ready for something else. So there's all kinds of interactions, and you can be part of the creation process. You don't have to open your mic. There's the silent line of communication we truly understand. But feel free to ask a question or make a comment or just say what you think. So if we're dreaming and we're traveling and our soul is going across the universe without the cosmic rays, or maybe the soul is working with the cosmic rays that we're totally unaware of, but for the physicality to transmute, we need to create those rays in a system, as I understand it, so far, which is not much that I understand.
Well, again, you are really very correct, because in our dream state, we have this capability. And so that capability is inherent in our soul.
Right, right. And our soul is not connected to this planet. Now, I thought we were connected, or is it just the physicality? He said the soul was coming from deep
No,
space.
it's a sentimentality. You know, when you come home, which home do you go to? You know, you talk to anyone in their house and they're going to tell you that they're at home. So if you're going to go home, which house are you going to go to? If I go to your house, I'll tell you what, I won't be home. You'll be home, but I won't be home. So there's a sentimentality to a certain place. So you're going to go home and you know where that home is. So where the problem comes in is where you don't know where your home is. or if the home is the local bar, right? Because you don't want to go home. So this is where the plasma brings in the peace and tranquility. And so you not only create home as a place, but you create home as a refuge, because that's really what a home is. And it should be edifying. When you have a couple that's working together, 1 and 1 is more than 2. But when you have one who is a parasitic action on the other, and you find that one keeps prospering and the other is diminishing. And so you see that this is what we happen when you bind energy at the expense of others. And you say, well, you know, I love you, but I love you as long as you provide for me. And I love you as long as you're alive. Once you're dead, I don't love you anymore. You know, but what are you contributing to that coexistence? That becomes the question. So we're only emphasized on the one-way street, what's in it for me kind of thing. So we have to realize that the strength of the family is from the two working together. And then the two working together create an environment so that the children see the same benefit. And then from there, they can move to the next level independently. That's what you want. And that's what life is about. Going from being a child to being an adult is a process of learning. And so, therefore, if the physicality benefits through the growth, then the soul of the body must benefit through the growth. And therefore, the soul of the man must benefit through the growth. By extension, the soul of the earth must likewise benefit. What we are coming to realize, despite how dense the earth is, the gamma rays fly right through the earth as if it's not even there. So the conventional physics says it has to do with the porosity. It has to do with the size of the field. The size of the gamma ray is so small that it penetrates in between the atomic network of whatever it is, of whatever element it is. But we have to understand, in all cases, there's a plasmatic reality and a physical reality. And so the plasmatic reality is first. And so when we're saying the gamma rays, we haven't specified if they're plasmatic or if they're physical. Now, maybe, and I can't confirm, but, you know, the topic has come up. If we are now entertaining the interaction with these gamma rays, is it possible that these gamma rays are not physical, but more like PM ticks? In other words, energy packs. So that question, I'm sure, will be answered shortly.
Right, and it certainly seems like we are going to be making many new friends. You know, they say if a person gets one friend other than your husband, your wife, your parents, your children, you've been a success at living. Most of the relationships are acquaintances. But I think once we start traveling, we're going to really make some solid friends in the universe. So yes, Alex, you have friends on Jupiter or another star somewhere. Perhaps we're
yeah.
going to experience this as real friends in the universe. Mr. Ketch says he calls them friends, these universal entities or creatures or citizens of the universe.
Well, as we've discovered, they're in a different reality dimension. They're in a different energy state. And so that state is not visible to us. But, that's not a commentary. That's just a statement of fact. So, if you're on the one side of the mountain, you can't see on the other side. That doesn't mean the other side doesn't exist. It's just like the radio station, on your radio. You turn it on. I don't hear the music. Well, you got to tune in. So if you want to see the other side of the mountain, well, you have to go there. So the same thing, if you want to interact with another reality dimension, you have to change to that energy state. Is it a higher energy state or is it a lower energy state, right? And so we find that the physical energy state is the lowest energy state. But is that a condemnation? Is the lowest energy state a condemnation? Oh, you're in a low energy state, you're a bottom feeder. Is that what it implies? Or are we experiencing a beauty on this beautiful planet? And are we truly then experiencing heaven? Why are we always looking at heaven as some other place than where we are? Why can't we admit we are in heaven? But we keep making this garbage and there's no way to throw it. So we have to, assume our responsibility. Not assume that we have it. Assume the responsibility, as in take up the responsibility. Take up the flag. Take up your position. Be responsible. And this really doesn't have anything to do with the financial aspect of the capability, because the financial capability is a man-made construct. But we have now come to a very critical stage where this man-made construct is sitting over us. And we are going through a very dramatic shift in this man-made construct. So we have to adapt to this new game plan, and we can't do it by dwelling on the man-made construct. We have to look at the new possibilities created by the plasma science. Go ahead, Mark.
No, he said in the teaching of the last workshop, in the next few weeks, he's going to change the knowledge of man. Now, hopefully he's not saying next few years, and he said next few weeks, but it seems like this is coming right around the corner. He says we're going to rely on the fields of the universe. And then another interesting, he said, when you walk into the new systems, your soul will shine. So it's just amazing what's about to take place. And I think everyone on this planet that observes it will be in awe of what's actually happening here.
So I would just like to draw a parallel to the game of chess, because unlike the game of poker, where the objective is to lie, cheat, and steal, but in the game of chess is also to conquer. But the difference is that you can see what your opponent is doing, and so there's a proactive and a reactive move that you can always make. But the thing is what's really, really funny is that when you say, well, I didn't see that move. Well, how can you not see that when all the pieces are exposed? And so it really boils down to the skill of the people who are working with this. So this is one of the reasons that all of you are spending this valuable time at these meetings is to have a broader understanding. Because like all the books in the library, you don't have time to read all the books. So what you have to have is a bridge of knowing to gain this insight. Because you already have the knowledge within you, but how can you interpret that in our earth space? And then, you know, here we are with ambitions to go into outer space, and we don't even know where we are. You know, well, hey, wait a second, you know, you're out of your league, you're out of your class, you don't have the knowledge, you don't have the experience. And that's kind of what's been holding us back. But now we've come across a visible binding and a visible limitation to man's prosperity. And man cannot prosper without peace. Not to say that there aren't men who prosper in wartime, but to say that the common man will prosper with peace. And the universal community prospers that way. So the ticket to the universal community is through peace. So this is not a slogan. This is not a feel good, feel warm, fuzzy, you know, expression. This is the truth. This is the reality. That's the way the universe works. And so there isn't this confrontation. There's energy given and energy taken. And the decision has to do with the benefit, if you will, to the participants. And it's only the participants can decide on this. And if the participant wishes to do this at the exclusion of his neighbor, it's the same thing as doing it at the exclusion of the consultation of his own soul. And so you find that too many of us at this point in time have disconnected the soul of the body from the soul of the man. And it's affected the earth. So we have this disconnect between the soul of the earth and the soul of the earth body. And who's in between? We are. We are in the biosphere in between. We are running interference. So are we setting up a barrier, or are we absorbing the fields? Are we part of the transition? Are we part of the transmission? And if we understand this correctly, then the bonus round is we become part of the transmutation. That's the direction that we're going. So now that we know the direction that we're going, why would you want to go in any other direction?
And the teaching is not over. He indicated that they're going to be teaching us, and you'll have access to all of it. But he said the world peace is beginning in 2023, and man becomes educated the true way. Is that through the fields, Alex? He said the system is going to deliver sustainable cosmic rays, which he indicated was the hardest to teach.
It really is. And this is my own personal challenge, because I have already extended beyond my my education. So when you look at the headings, and this is the reason I leave this panel up, and you look at the headings of what I plan on talking about in the next 4 weeks, is really to answer these questions, because when we look at our Earth space, you know, we look at it as a physical thing, and we don't see the energy behind it. So when we're looking at a volcano, you know, all we see is this stuff that's spewing out, but, you know, it's hot. Where did it get hot? How did it get hot? And it's fluid. How did it get fluid? I mean, like, why is it fluid? If I dig down 10 feet, I'm going to dig into soil. Or if I drill through rock, I'm going to, you know, find more rock, and then I may find a cavern under the rock. But you go to a certain point, that boundary between the, you know, the crust of the earth and the magmosphere, and then you get into this lava. Well, it's hot and it's bright red. I mean, like it's on fire. You throw anything in there, it's going to burn up, right? There's smoke. When there's smoke, there's fire, right? So the thing is, isn't that what happens when you start to bleed? Do you notice that the fluid comes out of the wound, or the fluid comes out of the pimple? And if you keep pressing it, it turns red, which is blood. So that means is that that fluid, when it comes in contact with the oxygen, oxidizes and turns red. The volcano would be exactly the same. So that burning that you see that's coming out of the volcano, that is the magmosphere coming in contact with the oxygen of the atmosphere. And at that point, it becomes crust. And at that point, it is trying to differentiate into something. And how can it differentiate if it's just a nebulous rotating field? And so part of the discussion today is to understand two fields together interact and create the third field, right? And if the two fields individually are in balance, well, the third field will not be created, cannot be created. And so fortunately for us, no two fields are the same. There's always a higher field strength and a lower field strength, whether it's in the same dimension or in multi-dimensions, whether it's multipolar or different speeds of rotation, or even opposite rotation. Well, opposite rotation only indicates polarity. And it is this interaction which creates the bounty. And so when we look at all the planets, and if we were to sit back in a chair and say, oh, you know, which planet would you like to get to? I say, oh, well, what's my choice? Well, you have the solar system and you have the solar system. Oh, okay, so it's going to be the solar system. So that's the first choice. And then within the first choice, you say, well, which planet is going to be? And so you look and say, you know, well, it's not going to be Venus. And then, oh, Mars is not in a great shape. Oh, look at Earth. Earth is really cool. Yeah, Earth is really beautiful. Yeah, so my preference is to come to Earth. And we've all made that decision. And the thing is, we're going through life and forgetting that we made that decision. We made that decision. Why did we make that decision? What is our purpose? This is a tough question, and it demands an answer. And only each of us individually can answer that question. And what we find as we come to that rational conclusion, it happens when the soul of the man and the soul of the body interact in a peaceful manner. And then we start harvesting the plasma energy of the plasma universe.
Just stepping away for 30 seconds. Be right back.
This interaction is what we're missing. The realization of this interaction, because we can't see it. It's in a higher energy state. And so the only thing that we can see is the feedback state, the feedback that is being fed. And so if we pattern our lives based on the feedback, we're missing the show.
Alex, were you saying the magma, when it hits the air, that's when, is it in a plasmatic state before? When it's inside the earth? The same with our bodies in a way that
100%.
really. I remember Mr. Kesh talking about meteors and asteroids. One of the reasons we don't see them coming in before they hit the atmosphere is because they're in a plasma state, so they cannot be picked up by the radars. But once they interact with the fields or the inertia of the planet, they turn into a solid meteor or asteroid and enter the Earth zone. So
and this is the same thing that happens with the amino acid.
Also,
well, the amino acid in a plasmatic state is a precursor for the amino acid in the physical state.
okay.
Because the amino acid interaction is within the skin of the body. And within the skin of the body is a plasmatic vacuum condition.
Mm-hmm.
So it cannot be physical amino acid. Sometimes if you want to figure out what something is, it's hard to do when you can't see it and it's transparent or it's non-visible. So you got to look at the neighbors. And this is what Immanuel Velikovsky did with history. You know, the history of your country is also relevant to the history of your neighbor. And then he found out that our history, the way it was taught to us, was out of whack by 700 years. And then you say, well, okay, is it 700 years forward or 700 years back? Or maybe it's 350 forward and 350 back. You know, which one is it? So then you have to look at the neighbors of the neighbors and try and decide. And then you find, well, when you go back and you look at the 7 major civilizations on this planet, and all of them talk about the Great Flood. What? So is that a figment of someone's imagination? Every civilization has the same story? You know what? That's history. That's the true history. So, you know, the current history is obliterated by the winner of the war. The winner writes the history. Well, you can only obfuscate the truth for so long. And if you do an investigation deep enough, then you'll find out. And, you know, me as a city slicker, I don't know anything about volcanoes. And then when the volcanoes were explained to me and how they affect the weather, and I say, well, what do volcanoes and the weather have in common? And that is, they reflect the emotion of this planet. And what impacts the emotion of this planet? Could it be man?
Could be. There's a large volcano in Hawaii, I think, that's been rumbling the last week or so, or two. But there's, as you said, 80% of the volcanoes are under the ocean. At least 10,000 volcanoes are going off simultaneously all the time.
Mark,
a lot
I've been here. Can I say something?
I was just going to say, Dean, that's an awful lot of pimples. Anyway, welcome to the meeting. Glad to have you.
Thank you, Alex, for a beautiful presentation as usual. Thank you for your teaching. Thank you, Mark, for presenting. Wonderful. Thank everybody for being present. What you just spoken about there was this consciousness of the thoughts and intentions of mankind, of humanity, and I think it's not just humanity. I think this consciousness that sets this field strength that causes different weather patterns and anomalies in within the structure of the planet is the emotion that's set by not just humanity. I think this process goes further out than that. I think when the environment is unbalanced, or we have a condition that is not that is just taking, then it's obviously going to affect all the souls, all the field strengths that are present, and so they all have a say. And if none are higher and none are lower, then a bacteria to a elephant and everything else in between, anything you can think of, any creature, any soul is going to have an influence upon the weather pattern in the environment that they're within. So for me, that's very relevant. That when we have a position, a place where it's balanced and there's not this constant turmoil of interactions of the fear and the emotions that are raised by the conditions set by our environment and we know what we're speaking about. I'm going round in circles here. The way that the interactions happen through the conscious effect by a lot of conscious thoughts towards damaging or not being constructive in a certain way. They seem to want to always oppose and create a condition that manifests as a dividing position. And we're within the foundation and the ethos, we're all about uniting and bringing it all together and bringing everything back together as one and bringing it into a balanced condition. And so there's that thought process of being in an environment that actually is triggering off emotions in any shape or form is bound to give a condition that causes not just the weather, but the emotion from one soul to another to constantly fluctuate. And I think many of us have experienced this in our environments because of the conditions that we find ourselves in. And I'm sure that most of it we have constructed ourselves with our own thoughts and intentions. Even though we don't do it intentionally, I think sometimes if we go to sleep, if we soul travel, then we're in a different position. But when we are conscious, many creatures and souls and people, and however you'd like to describe it, have thoughts that constantly come across. They come into their field strength. They come into their matter state mind, and then this has directly an effect that radiates out. If we are GANs, if we are big gases with this consciousness that evaporates through our very pores, that filtering process, then that goes out into the environment and it affects everything, including the weather and each and every other soul. So that position of being able to consciously, I don't want to use the word control, but be aware of our position and what we are giving out in any one moment has a big influence and effect on not only ourselves, but on many other situations. I think that's supposed to.
I liked it when you said the other day, Dean, we're nothing more than a collection of intelligent gases.
Exactly. That's exactly what we are.
Where did you hear that? Let me guess.
Yeah, no, I actually, Mr. Kesh said this a long time ago.
Hmm.
With many things, Mr. Kesh says, with all of us, certain things stick, and we seem to remember them, or they come back into our conscious thought at some point. And I have this a lot with Mr. Kesh's teachings. You know, he touches us on a soul level, and and we know it, and and when that consciously touches us in a certain way, then it feeds through back to the physicality, and sometimes the physicality has to, jump and move and respond to that information.
Are you thinking that the nuclear plasma, which he had talked about several workshops or more than that ago, is similar to these cosmic rays? Is this what he's talking about here? Or do you know a place where he talked about them? I think someone said workshop 317, but he said we could go back and review and put it together a little bit better by going back and re-listening to those. So cosmic rays, nuclear plasma, is this something similar? I'm thinking it is.
I'm sure it is, Mark. I'm absolutely sure. We know that we are. I mean, if we have the capability, when we leave our physicality, to have the energy impact of 18 Hiroshima bombs, or whatever, however you want to describe it, Mr. Kesh said once, then yeah, we have all the capabilities of a nuclear reactor within ourselves. We have that energy, and we can release that. And I don't think it's just when we decide to leave the physicality. We have that unlimited ability in this very moment. Each and every one of us. We just need to come to a position where we. I don't know. It's that enlightenment thing again. It's when the light switches on. It's when the plasma ignition happens. It's when you suddenly become full of light, or however you want to describe it. Then that process takes place naturally, and I think that also happens in each and every moment, with each and every cell, with each and every tiny neutron, electron, proton, however you'd like to describe it. It's happening constantly. When you see a condition where you see when a baby is born or conceived, you suddenly see that little ray of light that comes around this particular cell. It lights up. It's an interaction. It's a nuclear interaction. That's one way of describing it. It's an interaction that is cosmic rays. It's in the matter state, I know, but it's still using those same energies, to my understanding anyway.
Right. That's where he said he could take a cup of tap water, and within seconds it becomes radioactive, but perhaps in the plasmatic state, which is safe, but it still contains those energies.
Yeah. I'm sure Mr. Kesh could do many things.
Oh.
He doesn't show all of it. Has to do it bit by bit, piecemeal. But I'm sure that that it would be very easy for Mr. Kesh to literally create anything by literally putting his finger in the liquid and using certain other conditions. There's many ways to do things, and that interaction can happen almost instantaneously once you have that knowledge. Do you not think?
Yeah. I was just thinking how silly the world leaders will feel of themselves once this starts to take place. And again, there's no punishment, but that it's been dragged on for so long when the beauty's been sitting on this planet for so long as well.
Yeah, most definitely, Mark. It's I think it's got very wearing for many who've had to endure this condition for so long, and it is time for the souls that have been continuously creating these conditions to actually themselves to wake up and really start taking responsibility for their actions, thoughts, and deeds, and yeah, their intentions. Because, as you know, and we all know now, on a soul level, they can be interacted with and and just elevated to bring about a balance. So no, and it's just a giving condition. However, it will, as we know through the soul interaction, it will create a condition where they will be elevated. So they really haven't got a choice anyway. So they might as well, in this moment, be correct.
When you're in Linz, has he ever mentioned anything about the systems interacting with the soul of the planet? This is
Other than
where
what
we're
you
short,
said,
isn't it? The soul of this planet, whose short itself is taking from its own creation. So for that process to stop, the soul on this planet has to become elevated.
yeah, of course. I always look at it. It's a very simple process. I always make things. So we've always been taught that, or we've been experienced through Mr. Kesh's giving to us, that from an atom to a universe. So that atom goes through a process where it will just open up, and it will have to give exactly the same as a universe. So it, for me, it's the same. It doesn't matter whether it's a planet, a cell in your body, or a cell, or a galaxy. It's the same thing. And so eventually, it's inevitable that it's going to happen. It can only be this. It can only. That's all it could ever be. So, and when you go onto the size ratio of an atom or a planet, and then you compare that to a universe, it's there's really no difference, because it's all the same thing. So it's that transmutation in the moment that causes the reaction, nuclear, the light coming on, the enlightenment, the elevation of any plasma.
And I wonder if the soul of this planet is aware that it is being elevated by maybe a small percentage at this time of its inhabitants and the universal community, but later on, an even bigger thrust or elevation, enlightenment of the soul of this planet.
Once the souls, as we've spoken about earlier on, once the souls all start to understand and start to receive some of this knowledge and the field strength that it gathers, and start to elevate even slightly, and start thinking and using intentions in the correct way, like the ethos of the foundation, then things are going to, by order of magnitude, going to grow very, very quickly.
Yeah.
When you look back to I don't know, many years ago, 10, 12 years ago, when the understanding of it was there then through the teachings. But when you think of the interactions and the way that it's gone from that small amount of time, which doesn't exist, then it's already consciously expanded greatly. And then once this situation happens where a soul, maybe just one, is elevated enough, then the whole spectrum of this cell, which is the planet, this which we're all part of, then it all gets elevated at the same time. So, as Mr. Kesh has said many times, it only takes one. However, one is all of us, so it will happen to all of us.
Yeah, it's just amazing that we could be part of this, and I don't think we fully grasp it yet. but we're getting there. That, you know, we're going to help bring this change. And then, of course, once that happens, then the confidence grows to perhaps do this in other places in the universe, similar to what Mr. Kesh does. This is what I think we're sort of being trained or groomed for, in a way.
Yeah, I think Alex is going to make a very good Mr. Kesh somewhere else at some point, Jess.
Yeah, we'll be speaking the words of the creator, the actions, the thoughts, and so on. So we'll be
Exactly.
satellites way deep, deep in this cosmos as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And if you think, Mark, that the cosmos can go both ways, so it can be the smallest point as well. So it doesn't have to be going, when we say going out into space, you know, inner space as well, as Alex and all speaks about. It's within. It's, you know, it can be anywhere, anything, we're everything in any moment. So yeah.
Right. And he talked about going through the materials of Earth. I don't know why we would want to do that, just for more exploration and adding to our knowledge.
Then that goes back to the usual thing, though, Mark, doesn't it? Then that goes back to loving our physicalities.
I'd like to add to Dean's thought here, please. And that is...
Hi, Alex. How are you?
I'm very good, Dean, and I'm so glad that you're here. I need to be polite and, you know, let you follow in Mr. Kesh's footsteps ahead of me. Now, the thing is I always was wondering, as I'm talking from a personal standpoint here, is, you know, what are we doing here on this planet? And so that migrated to the question of, is this planet called us here? And then my question migrated to us is, well, you know, why are we here on this planet that called us here? And if it called us here, then we answered. And when did we do this? So obviously we did this before we were born. But the interaction between us as man space and between the Earth as Earth space is not the only consideration. And so the viewpoint has migrated to the point to understand that the deficiencies of man and the deficiencies of Earth are interchanged, interacted, intertwined. And so the problem then becomes, this whole Earth is under quarantine. But not only, there are other places that are having the same problem. And the reason that is a fact is because the inner space is radiating out. And so the maladies that this planet is experiencing are likewise radiating out. And so they must interact with the other spaces. We're just going to call them spaces. We didn't say where these spaces are or which dimension they are in, but what I'm saying is this effect must interact. It must interact on a plasmatic basis. So the malady here is the malady there as well. So the containment of this malady is done through the same way that we have the capability of absorbing plasma energy or creating a barrier of these fields. The determination of what creates the success with respect to these plasmatic fields is the ethos of the universe. So it becomes unquestionable. If we're talking about creation, then we have to have a compassion for our fellow man. And if we don't have a compassion for our fellow man, then we are abusing creation. And so that becomes the criteria. And if man space is abusing creation and indirectly causing Earth space to suffer from the abuse of this creation. And the other spaces within the nearness and proximity of this are also suffering this abuse. So what we're looking at is this containment. And the question then becomes is, how do we go through this, shall we say, prison breakout? And so the first thing is we have to do is to overcome these deficiencies. We're in the post-June the 6th. We're in fact post-October the 14th, 2021 era. And so these deficiencies, the creator has facilitated. Now there's a time lag between our awareness and then our incorporation of this awareness. We're now in the post-June the 6th, where we've basically, after waiting 12 years and not being stagnant within those 12 years, but basically giving the world leaders 12 years to incorporate this. And now we've come to the point where we see the results. It's a total failure. So we have to carry on, and we are carrying on. And in that process, we've now come to an acceleration. But that acceleration is not only on our end, as we say, you know, there's a chess game that's going on, and we can see what the others are doing. And they are accelerating their agenda as well, to the point now where we're seeing Germany in a total collapse, total economic collapse. I mean, how do you replace 80,000 jobs in a matter of a week? And so this is not our dilemma. This is the dilemma of the powers that are governing. And this now becomes a test of their intestinal fortitude. Do they carry on with their disconnect for the compassion of humanity, or do they suddenly reconnect and say, oh my God, look at what I've done? And the change happens. So the rate of change is now in balance. And so our call here just happens to be at the crux of the problem. And there's a uniqueness here because we have this physicality, and all the time this physicality has been a diminishment because it's the lowest energy state. But really, it's a prestigious capability that gives us a unique capability that even the universal community is not capable of partaking in. There are universal beings that engage in the physicality and have this capability, but by the rules of the universal community, they are abstaining from this interference. But not all of the universal community are following the rules also. And so this assumption that these members of the universal community are of a higher energy state, maybe in terms of shall we say, a reality dimension, but are they higher in terms of morality? And so it all depends on whether or not you're within the sphere of influence or you're on the outside of the sphere of influence, trying to figure out how to elevate this inner portion, this inner space of this sphere of influence. And so I submit that ManSpace is part of this and working in tandem with the EARTHSPACE, which is a part of this. But the relationship is cosmic. That's the new revelation. Thank you.
Beautifully said, Alex. Yeah, yeah, the cosmos is always there. It's in every single part of us. We're all, you know, we're in the matter state, and we're on a beautiful planet. We're in a wonderful position. However, we are on a if you take a viewpoint of it's a one cell, and it could be one cell in a very tiny part of a finger, say, and it's so small you can't see it. And yet that finger, when you expand out and you come back and you go further back, there's a body. I'm not talking about a physical body, but a body, a totality. And so it's everything you speak about this is what's so absurd with what's happening is when you understand that it is on a plasmatic level, on a soul level, then all these conditions that are being created and manifesting can be transmuted to a constructive, beautiful thought process that can illuminate and elevate. And that process is just a thought, literally just a thought. And it's the conscious thought of the creator.
And you know what else? This is the unbelievably strong covalent bond that is, when you look at the list of panelists today, and you just have a quick perusal, and it's not the quantity, it's the quality. The quality of the panelists here is amazing.
They're all beautiful souls, Alex. They're all very incredibly diverse, universal beings universal souls that have been present for a very long time.
Yeah, but their time is precious.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not here to waste their time.
And just a thought, you said, Dean, and isn't this what Velikovsky? I know we had studied him in another group I was in, and he had coined something called the noosphere, which is sort of interactions going on in the brain, let's say. Or again, I can't recall exactly, but
you know what, Mark?
came up with that term, the noosphere, the noosphere.
This is the P stone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's it. That's very true, Alex. What you just said there. That is the peace stone, and that is in any single moment where you can actually interact with it, just with a thought, a conscious thought that just the intention is just set that it's you go to that position, you just you radiate that out, you give that plasma to another plasma on a soul level, on a cellular level, on a physicality, however you want to describe it, and you just create this plasma dome.
Diane says in the chat, from me, memory, questionable. Didn't Mr. Kesh correct that mistake, shortcoming in the fields, question mark, that occurred with the creation of Earth when he, Mr. Kesh, lifted off the ground? I thought he was spreading the essence of peace, the fields of peace, and the soul of peace all across the planet, and probably for the soul of this planet as well. Any comments from anyone?
Feedback is a byproduct of the feeding.
It's interesting that thank you, Alex, for that comment. I think you're correct there. It's interesting that Mr. Kesh made that position, that saying that he was physically. Did he say physically, Mark? Did he say physically lifted off his feet?
Yeah, I think it's 5 to 10 centimeters. He said it was so strong that it literally lifted him 5 to 10 centimeters off the ground, the wish he made.
Yeah, I concur.
Or what he gave.
Do you think by giving that he suddenly took the position of bringing his soul outside of his physicality?
Well, isn't that it? if you're broadcasting, you can't limit to what you're broadcasting to, and that broadcast becomes a residue of you. So the basis, the foundation, the maggraph is already there. So you only have to add a little bit. And then as you're broadcasting to others, what you're doing now is elevating. And then suddenly you get this feedback. And how many do you get the feedback from? Well, you can only be open, but you can't determine the feedback because the feedback has to come from someone who is open. So as more open, then the feedback is likewise more. So, that's the difference between, say, playing a nightclub and you have 200 people, or playing a stadium and you have 80,000 people. So the feedback is greater and the rush is greater. There's no question about it. But that rush is energy in motion.
I
Okay,
think. Yeah.
go ahead.
Sorry, Mark. No, you go ahead, Mark.
No,
Go
no,
ahead.
I was just going to say we're approaching midnight, and I don't think we should go past that. Am I correct, Dean? Are we about 10 minutes before midnight there?
We are indeed, yeah. I've got 23:48 at the moment. Yes.
Correct. Okay, but please go ahead, or anyone else that would like to come in.
Yeah, let somebody else have a beautiful interaction.
We appreciate
Thank you,
you joining us always, Dean.
Yeah, thank you.
You're
Thank
so
you, Mark.
intimately involved in the Links expedition, and you're willing to share so beautifully and so freely. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Yes, thank you, Dean. And I would just want to take a moment to thank everybody for allowing me to present today as well. So the feedback that I'm getting here is very strong, and I appreciate it greatly. So stand by for another exciting week coming down the pipe. Over to you, Mark.
Okay, Gallup says, thank you, everyone, and especially Alex. Lisbeth said, nice voices. And to think that the most of the billions of people on this planet have no clue of what's in store for them. This beautiful gift that's being brought to this planet by all of us. As Mr. Kesh said, it's not him anymore. It's now all of us holding a small piece of this, but they're in for a great, great surprise. And I'd say it's about time, but again, the timing has got to be correct. And of course, it's a process. It's going to not change like in a millisecond, but over time, things will become correct. Better than they ever have been on this planet since its creation. And as you said, Alex, there are many civilizations out there just like our own. As Mr. Kesh indicated, there's civilizations like ours, just learning how to hunt, just discovering fire, and they need this knowledge in their development. Perhaps not to go as far and as long off the path as we have here. So there's work to do in the universe. I don't think you'll ever be unemployed or underemployed. And of course, you're being employed by the creator. So there's no pay involved.